Hello Doctor Who fans, my name is Francis and welcome to my channel. I know in the past I've typically covered Marvel related topics on this channel, but for once I wanted to try and get my thoughts out on another franchise that, much like Marvel, I also have a lot of passion for. For me, the most exciting thing about the future of Doctor Who is the presence of Russell T Davies. Not only is he an incredible writer, but he knows exactly what the show needs in order to keep it competitive with other popular TV shows these days. And with the show now having the backing of Bad Wolf Studios and a Disney Plus deal that will distribute the show internationally, it's clear that a lot of effort is going into expanding the audience and presence of the show. In one of the most recent issues of Doctor Who magazine, Russell makes it clear that he really wants to cut down on the gap years that the show has had recently. The gaps started to come in towards the end of the Stephen Moffat era and then were just completely present throughout the Chris Chibnall era. Granted, some of that was due to COVID and we were pretty lucky to get any episodes of Doctor Who during 2021 and 2022. We all know that Russell and Bad Wolf are going to be pushing for more Doctor Who spin-offs that will hopefully cut down on those gaps as well, as they try to mimic the success that Disney has had with their Marvel and Star Wars television spin-offs. And while it's fun to speculate what those spin-off shows could be, I'm really eager to know if there are any plans to push for more Doctor Who video games than there have ever been before. And I say that because when you look at Disney's success in the realm of video games, they have their subdivisions. Both Marvel games and Lucasfilm games have had this strategy over the years to seek out and partner up with video game studios that are passionate and want to work on their properties. And through this approach, we've gotten many great Star Wars and Marvel games recently. This strategy serves as one of the reasons we were able to get two of the best Spider-Man games from Insomniac. And as a Whovian myself, I can't help but think that the BBC and Bad Wolf should be looking to do something similar. When you look at what Doctor Who games are currently available to purchase, and then compare that to the other two big sci-fi juggernauts, Star Wars and Star Trek, Doctor Who's presence in the video game medium just currently isn't up to par with those other two franchises. And there's plenty of reasons for that. For one, Doctor Who isn't the easiest license to create a video game for. You're dealing with a show in which your protagonist can travel anywhere in time and space, and most incarnations of the Doctor genuinely try to lean towards being a pacifist, which means trying to make the Doctor playable in certain video game genres just wouldn't work. For example, you wouldn't expect to play as the Doctor in a third-person cover shooter, or having the Doctor go up against aliens in a 1v1 fighting game. It just wouldn't fit the brand. In fact, some of the more recent Doctor Who video games don't even have the player control the Doctor at all, which in some cases is quite weird to think about, that in order to justify a Doctor Who game being a certain genre, you have to prevent the Doctor from being a playable character. And even the real-world nature of the show itself can be problematic for video game development. Nowadays, video games can take up to 3+ years to develop, and Doctor Who has a history of revamping itself every 3 to 4 years, which can lead to potential problems with brand synergy. Ideally, when a new Doctor Who game releases, it should reflect the current era of the show. You don't want to rush the development of a modern Doctor Who game just to coincide with the current era, only to have it released to negative reviews and be filled with bugs and glitches, but at the same time you don't want a Doctor Who game to be stuck in development hell to the point that when it inevitably does get released, it stars an incarnation of the Doctor and companions that left the show years ago at that point. But look, despite these annoying barriers I've covered, none of this means creating a Doctor Who video game is impossible. There obviously have been decent attempts with Doctor Who video games in the past, but annoyingly, some of those decent attempts just aren't as easily accessible today. For example, my favourite Doctor Who video game was the adventure games from 2010, and while they were on Steam for a few years, they unfortunately got delisted back in 2017. Personally, I would really love it if the BBC and the original developer Sumo Digital were to relist that game in the future. Maybe do it in time for the show's 60th anniversary. They could also use it as an opportunity to put the adventure games on GOG, as that's a really good platform for old PC games. But anyway, I do kind of want to use this video as an opportunity to get across the types of Doctor Who video games that I hope we'll get to see in the future. If the BBC and Bad Wolf were to ever look back at what Doctor Who games have been made in the past, examining what worked and what hasn't worked, I actually wouldn't mind if they reached back out to studios they've worked with before. I know I just mentioned the adventure games, but that also serves as a really good starting point for one of the game ideas I want to talk about. Because I really want to see a modern day revival of the adventure games, featuring new compelling stories we've never seen before. For those of you that never got to play the Doctor Who adventure games, they were essentially episodic narrative driven adventures featuring Matt Smith's 11th Doctor, with the gameplay loop being that of exploring and interacting with objects in the environment, solving puzzles and carefully sneaking around some of the Doctor's greatest enemies with some light stealth gameplay. And one of the reasons why I love the adventure games so much is that not only was the episodic format very close to the structure of the show, but most of these adventures feature quite ambitious stories that probably wouldn't have been possible with the show's budget at the time. The first 2 episodes in particular feel like Dalek and Cyberman stories that were heavily inspired by their serials in the 1960s, and later episodes feature aliens we never got to see the 11th Doctor face in the main show, like the Vashta Narada and the Rutans. And going back to the idea that these episodes were quite ambitious narratively, I remember seeing in interviews years ago that Matt Smith always wanted to do an episode that was set in an underwater base, and while he never got to do that in live action, technically through episode 4 of the adventure games he did get to do that. And keep in mind, some of these episodes came out when there were gaps during Matt Smith's time as the Doctor, and if gaps between each new series and end of year festive specials are something the BBC and Bad Wolf are looking to cut down on, then having a modern day sequel / revival of the adventure games is something that I think would certainly help cut down on that. It gives fans something to play while the main show isn't on, and if we ever were to get a sequel, which I guess you would call it Doctor Who The New Adventure Games, the main thing I really want is more ambitious adventures that are not currently possible in the show. Now, fans are well aware that the show might be getting a budget increase through the Disney Plus deal, but for a while now I've really wanted a Doctor Who story set in the feudal Japan era, and if that's something that even with the show's increased Disney Plus budget is still out of the show's capability, then I think a new entry in the adventure games should have a go at it. I mean, why not? There are many video games today that are obsessed with that time period, and it would be really cool to see a Doctor Who adventure game hop on that bandwagon. But aside from wanting new ambitious adventures for an adventure games revival, I do want to see improvements made to the gameplay so that it can be brought up to the standards of modern interactive adventure games like Telltale's Walking Dead and the Life is Strange games, by implementing timed dialogue options, and of course I do want to see gameplay scenarios that introduce moral choices into the mix. At the same time though, I feel like they would need to be implemented very delicately for a multitude of reasons. One of them being that I don't think players should be allowed to make moral decisions when controlling the Doctor. Yes, throughout the show the Doctor has been faced with multiple moral conundrums, like whether or not he should destroy the Daleks or alter a fixed point in time. In some cases he's even said, this isn't my decision to make, I'm going to leave this up to humanity to decide. And while a lot of gamers these days expect a certain level of player agency in interactive narrative driven games, I'm just worried that allowing players to make decisions as the Doctor could lead to instances where it starts to feel like he's being written out of character. For example, let's say the Doctor is faced with having to save an entire planet of innocents but at risk of the companion dying, and the other choice is you save the companion but the entire planet filled with innocents is gone. Both negative outcomes are just something the Doctor would not let happen. They're way too clever for that. And you've got to remember that if you're working with a Doctor and a companion that's already well established in the main series, then the chances are the BBC and Bad Wolf would not let a moral choice like that be implemented into a video game, especially if it's meant to be seen as a somewhat canonical tie-in to the main show. And I feel like the best workaround for this, in order to make the player feel like their choices matter in a Doctor Who game, would be to find a gap in the Doctor's timeline where they are companionless, and give the developers the freedom to create a whole new original companion as the main protagonist, allowing the writers and the narrative designers to come up with the character's name and backstory, but also presenting opportunities to allow the player to mould the character's personality through the interactions and decisions the player will make throughout a game like that. And while I know a lot of what I'm saying makes it sound like I want Telltale to develop a game like that, I'd actually prefer it if it was done by Sumo Digital or Supermassive Games, which are both video game studios that have worked on Doctor Who games before. And yes, I'm well aware that the last Doctor Who game Supermassive made was The Eternity Clock, which got mixed to negative reviews. However, I get the feeling that if the BBC and Bad Wolf were to go back to Supermassive Games now, given the studio's experience with narrative-driven horror games like Until Dawn, The Quarry and the Dark Pictures anthology games, makes me believe that if they were to work on a Doctor Who game today, it would be much better than what they originally did with The Eternity Clock. Alright, I've spoken enough about wanting a new Doctor Who adventure game, but now I want to move on and talk about another game idea that I'd love to see get made. Despite the fact that Doctor Who is older than both Star Wars and Star Trek, it does bother me that we are yet to see a proper real-time strategy-based Doctor Who game. And I mention Star Wars and Star Trek because those two franchises have at least had one or two games in their libraries that fit into that genre. Now, I'll admit, I've not played that many RTS games to the point where I can say I'm an expert on the genre, but if one were to ever get made that was set in the Doctor Who universe, of course I'd jump at the chance to play a game like that, because it would be a completely different gameplay experience than what's come before. Not every Doctor Who fan necessarily wants a game that allows them to roleplay as the Doctor or a companion. I imagine some fans also want a game that allows them to control the armies of the Cybermen, the Daleks, and hell, even the Sontarans. It's similar thinking to the variety of Star Wars games we can play today. If you're looking for a game that lets you play as a Jedi, then play Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. And if you want a game that fully lets you control the Rebel Alliance and the Galactic Empire, then you'd go to something like the Battlefront games or the strategy game Star Wars Empire at War. Each Star Wars game scratches a certain itch for players, and I'm sure the BBC and Bad Wolf are capable of finding a studio that can scratch that strategy itch for Doctor Who fans. Even imagining the structure of that sort of game is really exciting to think about. Imagine at the start of a story campaign you pick the faction you want to control, whether it's the Daleks, the Cybermen or the Sontarans, and with each level you go from planet to planet waging war against the other enemy factions across the universe. The Daleks have the goal of exterminating all life in the cosmos, the Cybermen want to convert and upgrade all life in the universe so that they become like them, and the Sontarans want to terraform planets so that they can expand the Sontaran Empire. With each level you'll have to build a base and manage your resources for whatever faction you're playing as. You'll need to construct facilities in order to spawn your units. The Cybermen would require a cyber factory, the Daleks would require a genetics lab, and the Sontarans would need some sort of cloning facility. And the further you develop your base, you'll be able to construct other facilities dedicated towards enhancing your current units and building bigger, more powerful units like maybe a Dalek Emperor, a Cyber King, and I guess whatever the equivalent for a Sontaran might be. I know it sounds like I'm basically describing Halo Wars or Command and Conquer, but that's because I can't help but feel that some of the mechanics in those games would feel right at home in a Doctor Who strategy game. Even the idea of having leader units spawn on the battlefield is also quite transferable to Doctor Who. Imagine you play as the Daleks and you get to spawn in Davros, and he comes with his own special abilities, like one tied to his robot lightning hand that's offensive based, and another ability that's more of a passive trait where you can increase the speed at which you manufacture Daleks. That's just one example off the top of my head, and I'm pretty sure you could come up with other leader units for the other factions. Plus, this is the sort of game where you don't have to limit it to just being a single player experience. You could implement an online co-op mode and competitive multiplayer modes like the ones seen in the Halo Wars games. Now, while I am passionate for this sort of idea idea for a Doctor Who game, one of the biggest barriers I could see related to it harkens back to what I said earlier. If there was a strategy game like this, which I guess you could call Doctor Who Wars in Space and Time, then how do you go about including the main character of the series in a game like this? Do you just set the game in a parallel universe where he doesn't exist and call it a day? Do you have him only appear in cutscenes as he watches the battles play out? And is it even possible to factor him in a gameplay capacity? And would a game like this be able to find a good middle ground between being accessible enough to entry-level players, while also having enough gameplay depth for the hardcore fans of strategy games? These are all things I obviously don't have the answers to. Ideally, I think the right studio for this type of game would be Creative Assembly, as they've developed so many strategy games over the years, which includes the likes of many entries in the Total War franchise and Halo Wars 2. And we can't forget they also made Alien Isolation, which is considered by many to be one of the greatest sci-fi horror games of all time. But look, even if the BBC and Bad Wolf aren't able to partner up with Creative Assembly, I'm still open to the idea of any studio willing to take on a Doctor Who strategy game. Whether they're indie-sized, AAA-sized, or even AA-sized, I'm eager to see what studios are capable of with the Doctor Who license. So now that I've covered everything I wanted to say in regards to an RTS game set in the Doctor Who universe, I now want to move on to talking about the third and final game I want to discuss for this video. I know at the start of the video I gave a couple of examples of some video game genres that just wouldn't work when you play as the Doctor. However, that doesn't mean I'm completely against the idea of seeing any form of video game shooter that's set in the world of Doctor Who. It just depends on who the character is that the player will take control of. And personally, the only character I could logically see being able to carry their own video game that is also a first-person shooter would be River Song. And when I say first-person shooter, I don't mean run-and-gun Call of Duty style gameplay. I'm thinking more along the lines of something like the BioShock games or the recently released High on Life, where those games are very narrative-driven, have a wide selection of weapons and abilities. And when you think of the character of River Song in a gameplay sense, she does admittedly have a couple of weapons and gadgets that would be cool to use in a game like this. She has her regular blaster that she uses to fight aliens, the sonic blaster to cut through surfaces in the environment, her own sonic screwdriver that can switch between a blue and red setting, and even her own vortex manipulator which allows her to travel through time. And that last gadget in particular would be extremely fun to use, especially if it was integrated in a similar way to how Respawn incorporated time travel into one of the campaign levels of Titanfall 2, where in the level called Effect and Cause, the player is given a gadget that enables them to hop between two versions of the same level, one set in the past and one set in the present. It's definitely one of the best implementations of time travel I've ever seen in a game thus far, and would definitely feel right at home in a Doctor Who game if someone like River was given the spotlight. Now, we all know that River Song is well known for her convoluted encounters with the Doctor. They keep meeting each other in the wrong order, and when they do meet, they have to be careful not to spoil moments in each other's timelines that may not have happened yet. And with all those gadgets I described, some of them, like the sonic screwdriver, she was only able to obtain towards the end of her travels with the Doctor. So some of you might be wondering, well, how do you squeeze one more encounter out of River given what's left in her timeline at that point? And I think the best way to possibly do that would be to have her meet the 14th Doctor, because when you think about it, 14 is actually the most interesting one for her to meet. If this encounter were to take place after the events of the Husbands of River Song, but before the events of Silence in the Library, then it presents compelling avenues to write both characters. To River, she knows what the 10th Doctor is supposed to look like due to her diary, so when she sees 14, she'll assume that's 10 just with a different outfit. But to 14, he's at a point in his timeline where he's done every single encounter with River, and he knows that the 12th Doctor was meant to be seen as the last incarnation River met before going to the library, so he has to play along with her inaccurate assumption to ensure he doesn't ruin her final memories of 12 before she makes her sacrifice. And when you think about it even deeper, it actually enhances one of the first conversations the Doctor had with River Song. When we first met River in the main series and she realised the Doctor had never met her before, she says to the 10th Doctor his face is younger than she's ever seen it before, and if we were to go off just television appearances only, that line doesn't really make sense, because every other time she's met the Doctor in the main show it's been either 11 or 12, and so because the 14th Doctor is essentially 10 again but with more knowledge and much older, having him meet River would certainly help to rectify that minor inconsistency without severely damaging continuity. And I like this idea for a video game in a narrative sense because it has the potential to present so many fun sequences to the player that are just loaded with dramatic irony. We may be inhabiting the role of River Song, but we actually know more about this incarnation of the Doctor than she does. She could ask him questions like, "How old are you?" and he'll just respond with an answer like, "Oh, I'm 905 years old," even though to us as fans, we know he's much older than that. When thinking along the lines of the idea of this game being a first-person shooter, it's very important to think about the Doctor Who aliens that will lend themselves really well to motivating combat encounters. You could implement the obvious ones like the Daleks, the Cybermen and the Sontarans, and create different enemy types for those races. Plus, it would also be really cool to allow River to pick up their weapons upon defeating them as a way to add variety to the weapons she could acquire. But more importantly, because River is meant to be the main character, I think the number one aliens to include as villains for the game would be the Silents. Mainly because they're quite heavily tied to the character's backstory, and if they're not going to properly reappear in the television show, a video game that features them as the main antagonists would be a creative way to bring them back, and they would certainly make an interesting adversary for the 14th Doctor to face off against. Maybe they could even feature in a game like this as powerful mini-bosses. Now, while I am fascinated by the idea of having River Song be the lead in her own video game, there are some narrative and gameplay barriers I could see cropping up with this type of game. I think for some players, their enjoyment of the story would to an extent depend on how much they like River Song as a character. For example, you might feel aligned with the character in a gameplay sense and are eager to overcome the obstacles that get thrown her way, but when it comes to the writing of her character, you might find yourself annoyed by her personality and the way she's written. I'm on board with the idea of her interacting with the 14th Doctor and that deep down she doesn't know when he takes place. However, I'm fully aware that that sort of banter between the two characters is not enough to sustain a whole game. It's okay to have that sort of banter in the first few hours of the game, but as the narrative progresses, you've got to find ways to shake up the dynamic between the two, even if that means her getting close to discovering he's not telling the truth. In terms of gameplay barriers, they mostly relate to the gadgets she has, as some of them are quite ambitious, maybe even too ambitious. You know, how would you balance the capabilities of the Sonic Blaster and the Vortex Manipulator in terms of level design? You want them to feel useful, but you don't want one to overshadow the other, especially when it comes to the Vortex Manipulator. It would obviously be really cool if it was done in a similar way to how Titanfall 2 introduced time travel, but you have to keep in mind that Respawn were only able to implement that mechanic into one level of the campaign, and there were loads of challenges that studio had to overcome in order to get that level to work. So if it was challenging enough already for them to even get it to work for one level, imagine how much harder it's going to be for a studio making a Doctor Who game to try and feature that sort of mechanic for more than one level. Despite those hypothetical barriers, I am still interested in seeing River Song get her own video game. She's already had many of her own spin-offs in other mediums. She's had multiple audio dramas and even her own novel written by Alex Kingston, so you might as well make her the lead protagonist of her own video game at this point. I'm not entirely sure what studio I would like to see make a game like this. I could maybe see Rebellion being capable of doing this sort of game, mainly due to their experience with some of the AVP games, and that might make them a good fit for doing a first-person shooter set in the world of Doctor Who. Who. And that about does it for all the Doctor Who game ideas I'd like to see get made in the future. I'm genuinely really excited for this new era of Doctor Who, and I'm looking forward to what the future of the show has in store for us. I hope the show will expand even more so than it has done in the past, and that we will hopefully see better attempts made towards delivering compelling video games that utilise the Doctor Who license. Feel free to share your thoughts and opinions down below in the comments section, and also let me know if you have your own pitch for a Doctor Who video game. Let me know what type of gameplay genre it would fit into, and what studio would you also like to see make it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to hear from you all soon.